The courthouse clock showed 9:30 a.m. when James rolled his wheelchair through the heavy wooden doors. The sound of his wheels against the marble floor echoed in the grand hallway, each turn reminding him of how different his life had become. 3 years ago, he would have walked these same halls with confidence, his military boots clicking against the ground with purpose. Today, everything felt different. James stopped his wheelchair near the defendant's table and looked around the courtroom. The American flag hanging in the corner caught his eye, and for a moment, memories flooded back. He remembered the day he first raised his right hand to take the oath of service. He was just 19 then, full of dreams and ready to serve his country. His mother had been so proud that day, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son become a soldier. Now, at 34, James sat in a courtroom as a defendant. The charges against him were simple but embarrassing. He had been caught taking food from a local store without paying. It wasn't much, just some bread, milk, and basic medicine for his pain. But in the eyes of the law, it was still theft. The store owner had called the police, and here he was, waiting to learn his fate. The public defender assigned to his case was a young woman fresh out of law school. She had tried her best to understand his situation, but James could see the doubt in her eyes sometimes. How could someone explain what it felt like to go from being a decorated soldier to struggling to afford basic necessities? How could he make her understand the daily battle he fought just to get through each day? James's military service had been exemplary. He had served 3 tours overseas, leading his unit through some of the most dangerous missions. His fellow soldiers looked up to him, trusted him with their lives. He had received several medals for his bravery, including the Purple Heart and Bronze Star. These medals now sat in a dusty box at home, reminders of a life that seemed like it belonged to someone else. The explosion that changed everything happened during his final tour. His unit was conducting a routine patrol when their vehicle hit a hidden explosive device. The blast was so powerful that it threw James nearly 20 feet from the vehicle. When he woke up in the military hospital days later, the doctors told him the news that would reshape his entire world. His legs were severely damaged, and he would need multiple surgeries. Even then, they weren't sure if he would ever walk normally again. The months that followed were filled with operations, physical therapy, and pain that seemed to never end. James fought hard to recover, pushing himself through every exercise, refusing to give up hope. But despite all his efforts and the dedication of the medical team, his legs never fully healed. The damage was too extensive. He would need a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Returning to civilian life had been harder than any military mission James had ever faced. The military had been his life for over a decade. It gave him structure, purpose, and a sense of belonging. Suddenly, he found himself in a world that moved too fast and seemed to have little patience for his limitations. Simple tasks that he had never thought about before became daily challenges. Finding work proved nearly impossible. Many employers claimed they wanted to hire veterans, but when they saw James in his wheelchair, their enthusiasm quickly faded. They would make polite excuses, saying they would call him back, but the calls never came. Month after month, James sent out applications and attended interviews, only to face the same disappointment. The financial pressure began building slowly at first, then all at once. His military disability benefits were supposed to provide support, but the paperwork seemed endless, and the process moved at a snail's pace. Rent, utilities, medical expenses, and basic living costs didn't wait for government bureaucracy to catch up. James watched his savings disappear, one bill at a time. His mother had offered to help, but she was living on a fixed income herself. She had worked hard her entire life, raising James and his sister after their father left when they were young. Now she was dealing with her own health problems and couldn't afford to support him financially. James couldn't bear the thought of becoming a burden to the woman who had already sacrificed so much for him. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning 3 months ago. James had been living on very little food for days, trying to stretch his remaining money until his benefits came through. The pain in his legs was particularly bad that day, but he was out of the medication that helped him cope. He wheeled himself to the local convenience store, hoping to buy just enough food and medicine to get through another week. Standing in the store aisles, James felt overwhelmed by the simple mathematics of poverty. He had $12 in his wallet. The pain medication cost $8. A loaf of bread was $3. Milk was $4. No matter how he calculated it, he couldn't afford everything he needed. For a man who had once managed complex military operations, this simple problem felt impossible to solve. That's when desperation took over. James had never stolen anything in his life. He had been raised to believe in honesty and hard work. But hunger and pain have a way of changing a person's perspective. He slipped the bread and milk into the bag attached to his wheelchair, paid for the medicine, and tried to leave the store quickly. The store owner had been watching him, though. Security cameras had caught his actions, and before James could make it to the parking lot, he was confronted. The shame he felt in that moment was worse than any physical pain he had experienced. Here he was, a man who had served his country with honor, being accused of petty theft. The police arrived within minutes. They were professional but firm. James didn't try to deny what he had done. He explained his situation calmly, hoping they might understand, but rules were rules. He was arrested and charged with theft and disorderly conduct. The disorderly conduct charge came when he became emotional during questioning, not angry or violent, just overwhelmed by the situation he found himself in. News of his arrest spread quickly through his small community. Some people were sympathetic, understanding that desperation could drive a good man to make poor choices. Others were less forgiving, saying that his military service didn't give him the right to break the law. James felt the weight of their judgment every time he left his apartment. His sister had tried to be supportive, but she had her own family to worry about. She worked 2 jobs to support her children and couldn't afford to help him financially. She would call him regularly, checking on his well-being, but James could hear the worry in her voice. He knew she was afraid of what might happen to him if things continued to get worse. The legal process moved slowly, giving James plenty of time to think about how his life had reached this point. He remembered the young man who had eagerly enlisted in the military, ready to serve and protect his country. That person felt like a stranger now. The confident soldier who had led men through combat zones had been replaced by someone who struggled to navigate the simple challenges of daily life. Some nights, James would lie awake thinking about his fellow soldiers who hadn't made it home. He wondered if they would be disappointed in him now, seeing how far he had fallen. He had survived when others hadn't, and yet he felt like he was wasting the second chance he had been given. The survivor's guilt mixed with his current struggles created a weight that seemed impossible to bear. The Department of Veterans Affairs had assigned him a caseworker, but the system was overwhelmed and underfunded. Appointments were scheduled. Weeks apart, paperwork got lost and phone calls went unreturned. James felt like he was fighting a battle he couldn't win, against an enemy he couldn't see. At least in the military, he had known who he was fighting and why. As he sat in the courtroom that morning waiting for the judge to arrive, James thought about the irony of his situation. He had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution and the rule of law, and now he was about to be sentenced for breaking that same law. He understood that actions have consequences, but he couldn't help feeling that the system he had served so faithfully had somehow failed him in return. The courtroom began to fill with other people waiting for their cases to be heard. James recognized some faces from the neighborhood, people dealing with their own struggles and legal problems. He realized that many of them probably had stories similar to his, tales of good people forced into difficult situations by circumstances beyond their control. Behind him, he could hear his mother and sister talking quietly. They had taken time off work to be there for him, even though they couldn't afford to miss the income. Their presence meant everything to James, reminding him that despite all his failures and struggles, he was still loved and supported by the people who mattered most. The bailiff announced that court would begin soon, and James straightened up in his wheelchair. Whatever happened next, he was determined to face it with the same dignity he had tried to maintain throughout his military service. He had made mistakes, but he was still the same man who had served his country with honor. Today would be another test of his character, and he intended to meet it head-on. The heavy wooden door at the front of the courtroom creaked open, and everyone turned to watch as Judge Richardson entered. She was a woman in her late 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and wire-rimmed glasses that made her look stern and serious. Her black robe flowed behind her as she walked to the bench with quick, determined steps. James had heard about Judge Richardson from other people who had appeared in her courtroom. Some said she was fair but tough. Others warned that she didn't tolerate any nonsense and expected everyone to follow the rules exactly as written. The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Richardson." The sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the room as everyone stood up. Everyone except James, who remained seated in his wheelchair, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. He felt exposed and different, like a spotlight was shining directly on him while everyone else blended into the background. Judge Richardson settled into her chair and looked out over the courtroom with sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail. She had been a judge for over 20 years and had seen thousands of cases during that time. Her reputation for running an orderly courtroom was well known throughout the legal community. She believed that respect for the court was shown through proper behavior and following established traditions. "Please be seated," she said, and the room filled with the sound of people sitting down again. James watched as she organized her papers and put on her reading glasses. He could feel his heart beating faster as she prepared to call his case. The waiting was almost worse than whatever punishment he might receive. "The State versus James Washington," Judge Richardson announced, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet courtroom. James's lawyer, Ms. Peterson, stood up and walked to the table where James sat. She was young and inexperienced, but she had spent many hours trying to understand his case and prepare the best defense possible. "Your Honor," Ms. Peterson began, "my client is ready to proceed." Her voice was steady, but James could see her hands shaking slightly as she arranged her papers. This was probably one of her first major cases, and she seemed nervous about appearing before such an experienced judge. Judge Richardson looked down at the file in front of her and began reading the charges aloud. "Mr. Washington, you are charged with theft in the 3rd degree and disorderly conduct. How do you plead?" Her voice was businesslike and showed no emotion. To her, this was just another case in a long day of court proceedings. James cleared his throat and spoke as clearly as he could. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The words felt strange coming out of his mouth because he knew he had taken the items from the store. But Ms. Peterson had explained that they were pleading not guilty, so they could present his circumstances and hope for understanding from the court. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man in a dark suit, stood up and began presenting the state's case. He described the security camera footage that showed James taking the bread and milk without paying. He talked about the store owner's statement and the police report from that day. Everything he said was factual, but it painted James as just another criminal who had decided to break the law. As the prosecutor spoke, James felt smaller and smaller in his wheelchair. The man presenting the case didn't mention anything about his military service, his struggles with finding work, or the months he had gone without proper financial support. To the prosecutor, James was simply someone who had committed a crime and needed to be punished according to the law. When it was Ms. Peterson's turn to speak, she stood up with more confidence than James had expected. She had prepared carefully for this moment and was determined to help the court understand who James really was beyond the charges against him. "Your Honor," she began, "my client is a decorated military veteran who served our country with distinction for over 12 years. He completed 3 tours of duty overseas and was awarded the Purple Heart and Bronze Star for his service." She paused to let this information sink in before continuing. "Mr. Washington was severely injured during his final tour of duty. An explosive device destroyed his ability to walk normally, and he now requires a wheelchair for mobility. Since returning to civilian life, he has faced enormous challenges finding employment and receiving the support he needs from veteran services." James watched Judge Richardson's face as Ms. Peterson spoke, looking for any sign that this information was making an impact. The judge's expression remained unchanged. Her eyes focused on the papers in front of her. James began to worry that his military service wouldn't matter to her at all. Ms. Peterson continued her presentation, describing the months James had spent applying for jobs, the delays in processing his disability benefits, and the financial pressure that had built up over time. She explained that on the day of the incident, James had been living on very little food for several days and was in significant pain because he couldn't afford his medication. Your Honor, my client has never been in trouble with the law before this incident. His actions on that day were driven by desperation, not criminal intent. He is deeply ashamed of what happened and takes full responsibility for his choices. The prosecutor objected, saying that financial hardship was not an excuse for breaking the law. Judge Richardson agreed, reminding everyone in the courtroom that the law applied equally to all citizens regardless of their circumstances. James felt his hopes sinking as he realized that his story might not be enough to save him from punishment. After both sides had presented their arguments, Judge Richardson announced that she was ready to deliver her sentence. This was the moment James had been dreading since the day he was arrested. He had tried to prepare himself for the possibility of jail time, but the thought of being locked up terrified him more than any combat situation he had faced overseas. Mr. Washington, Judge Richardson said, looking directly at him for the first time during the proceedings, please stand for your sentencing. Her voice was firm and left no room for discussion. This was clearly a standard procedure that she followed with every defendant who appeared in her courtroom. James felt his chest tighten as the words hit him. The request seemed simple enough, but for him, it was impossible. His legs, damaged beyond repair by the explosion overseas, could not support his weight. He had not stood on his own since the day of his injury, and no amount of physical therapy had been able to change that reality. The courtroom fell silent as everyone waited for James to comply with the judge's order. He could feel the eyes of every person in the room focused on him. His mother, sitting in the gallery behind him, made a small gasping sound when she realized what was happening. His sister reached over and took their mother's hand, both of them watching helplessly as James struggled with the impossible request. Ms. Peterson jumped to her feet immediately. Your Honor, my client is unable to stand. As I mentioned earlier, he is a disabled veteran who requires a wheelchair for mobility due to injuries sustained during military service. Her voice was respectful but urgent, trying to explain the situation without seeming to challenge the judge's authority. Judge Richardson looked up from her papers with a stern expression. I heard your earlier statements, Counselor, but this court has established procedures that must be followed. All defendants are required to stand during sentencing as a sign of respect for the court and the legal process. There are no exceptions to this rule. The judge's words hit James like a physical blow. After everything he had sacrificed for his country, after losing the use of his legs in service to others, he was being told that he was being disrespectful by remaining seated in his wheelchair. The irony of the situation was almost too much, too bare. James felt anger rising in his chest, mixed with humiliation and frustration. He had never asked for special treatment or pity because of his disability. He had worked hard to maintain his dignity and independence despite his limitations, but now he was being made to feel like his sacrifice meant nothing, that his inability to stand somehow showed a lack of respect for the very system he had sworn to defend. Your Honor, James said quietly, his voice steady, despite the emotions swirling inside him. I understand the importance of showing respect to this court, but I gave my legs in service to this country. I have stood when it mattered most in places where standing meant the difference between life and death for the soldiers under my command. The courtroom was completely silent now. James could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears as he continued speaking. I cannot stand before you today, not because I choose not to, but because that ability was taken from me while I was defending the freedoms that allow this court to exist. I hope that my service and sacrifice can be seen as the ultimate sign of respect for the laws and values of this nation. Judge Richardson's expression changed slightly as James spoke. For the first time during the proceedings, she seemed to really look at him, not just as another defendant in her courtroom, but as a human being with a story that went far beyond the charges listed on the papers in front of her. The weight of his words seemed to settle over the entire courtroom like a heavy blanket. Ms. Peterson could see that something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. She quickly reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder that she had prepared, but hadn't planned to use unless absolutely necessary. Your Honor, I have documentation of my client's military service and medical records that I believe the court should review before proceeding with sentencing. Judge Richardson's face changed the moment James finished speaking. The stern expression that had been fixed on her features for the entire morning seemed to crack, like ice beginning to melt under warm sunlight. She stared at him for a long moment, really seeing him for the first time since he had entered her courtroom. The words he had spoken hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that went far beyond a simple legal proceeding. Ms. Peterson stepped forward with the thick folder in her hands, moving carefully toward the judge's bench. Your Honor, may I approach? She asked, her voice respectful but filled with urgency. She could sense that something important was happening, that the entire tone of the courtroom had shifted in those few seconds after James spoke. You may, Judge Richardson replied, her voice noticeably softer than it had been moments before. As Ms. Peterson walked toward her, the judge found herself looking back at James with different eyes. Instead of seeing just another defendant who had broken the law, she was beginning to see a man whose story was far more complex than the simple charges suggested. Ms. Peterson placed the folder on the judge's bench and opened it carefully. Your Honor, these are copies of Mr. Washington's complete military service records, his medical files from the Army hospital, and testimonials from his commanding officers and fellow soldiers. I believe these documents will help the court understand who my client really is and what he has been through. Judge Richardson picked up the first document with hands that trembled slightly. It was James's enlistment photo from 12 years earlier. The young man in the picture looked confident and proud, standing tall in his dress uniform with a smile that spoke of hope and determination. His eyes were bright with the excitement of someone ready to serve his country and make a difference in the world. The contrast between that photograph and the man sitting in the wheelchair before her was striking. Judge Richardson had to take a moment to process the difference. Here was clear evidence of how much James had sacrificed, how dramatically his life had been changed by his service to others. She turned to the next page, which contained his service record. The list of assignments, promotions, and achievements filled several pages. James had served in some of the most dangerous places in the world, leading soldiers through situations that most people could barely imagine. His record showed consistent excellence, with evaluations that praised his leadership, courage, and dedication to his men. The medical records told a different kind of story, one of pain and loss that made Judge Richardson's chest tighten as she read. The explosion that had changed James's life forever was described in clinical terms that somehow made it even more powerful. The force of the blast, the extent of his injuries, the multiple surgeries that followed, all of it was documented, in precise medical language that couldn't hide the human suffering behind the words. One report from his surgeon stood out particularly. It described how James had refused pain medication during his early recovery because he wanted to stay alert enough to check on the other soldiers who had been injured in the same attack. Even while dealing with his own devastating injuries, his first concern had been for the welfare of his men. But it was the testimonials from his fellow soldiers that truly moved Judge Richardson. One after another, these documents painted a picture of a man who had risked everything for others. There were stories of James crawling through enemy fire to rescue wounded soldiers, of him staying behind to make sure everyone else got to safety. First, of his refusal to leave his post even when he was badly injured. One testimonial from his former sergeant was particularly powerful. It described a mission where James's unit had been ambushed and surrounded. Despite being outnumbered and under heavy fire, James had organized a defense that saved the lives of 6 soldiers. He had been wounded twice during the fight but refused medical attention until all his men were safe. For his actions that day, he had been awarded the Bronze Star. Another document described the day James received his Purple Heart. Even from his hospital bed, barely able to speak because of his injuries, he had asked about every member of his unit. He wanted to know who was hurt, who needed help, who was being taken care of. The nurse who wrote the report said she had never seen anyone show such concern for others while dealing with such serious personal trauma. As Judge Richardson read through page after page, she began to understand that the man before her was not just a veteran, but a genuine hero. He had repeatedly put the lives of others before his own safety. He had shown courage under fire that most people could never match. And he had paid a terrible price for his service, losing not just his ability to walk, but his sense of purpose and place in the world. The financial records in the folder told another story that made Judge Richardson feel angry on James's behalf. Despite his injuries and his exemplary service record, he had been fighting for months to receive the benefits he had earned. Forms had been lost, appointments had been delayed, and phone calls had gone unreturned. The system that should have supported him after his sacrifice had instead left him struggling to survive. There were copies of job applications, dozens of them, all rejected. Some employers had been honest enough to say they weren't equipped to accommodate his disability. Others had simply stopped responding after learning about his wheelchair. The pattern was clear and heartbreaking. A decorated war hero couldn't find work because people saw his disability before they saw his abilities. Judge Richardson found herself thinking about her own son, who was about the same age as James. Her son had never served in the military, had never faced anything more dangerous than a difficult college exam. What would she feel if her son had sacrificed so much for his country, only to be treated the way James had been treated? The more she read, the more she realized how wrong she had been. Her insistence that James stand for sentencing wasn't just inappropriate, it was cruel. Here was a man who had literally given his legs in service to his country, and she had demanded that he do something physically impossible as a sign of respect. The irony was almost too painful to consider. Ms. Peterson watched the judge's face as she read through the documents. She could see the impact the records were having, the way Judge Richardson's expression was changing from stern authority to something much more human. The young lawyer had hoped these documents would make a difference, but she hadn't expected such a dramatic transformation. In the gallery behind James, his mother was quietly crying. She had lived through every moment of her son's military service, worrying about him every day he was overseas. She had been so proud when he received his medals, so devastated when he was injured. Watching him struggle as a civilian had been almost harder than worrying about him in combat, because she felt so helpless to make things better. His sister sat beside their mother, holding her hand and trying to stay strong. She had watched her brother change from a confident soldier to a man struggling with depression, pain, and a sense of worthlessness. She had seen him apply for job after job, only to be rejected again and again. The incident at the store had been the lowest point in a series of difficulties that seemed to have no end. The courtroom remained completely silent as Judge Richardson continued reading. Other people waiting for their cases to be heard had stopped talking, sensing that something important was happening. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in the drama unfolding before her. One of the last documents in the folder was a letter from James's former commanding officer, written just days after his injury. The officer described James as one of the finest soldiers he had ever known, someone who embodied everything good about military service. He wrote about James's leadership, his compassion for his men, and his willingness to sacrifice everything for others. The letter ended with a paragraph that made Judge Richardson close her eyes for a moment. The commanding officer had written, "If every American could see what Sergeant Washington did for his country, what he gave up so that others could live in freedom, there would never be any question about supporting our veterans when they come home. He has earned our respect, our gratitude, and our care for the rest of his life." Judge Richardson set the folder down on her bench and looked out at the courtroom. For 23 years, she had been a judge, dealing with thousands of cases and making countless decisions about guilt, innocence, and punishment. She had always prided herself on being fair and following the law exactly as it was written. But in all those years, she had never encountered a case that challenged her understanding of justice quite like this one. She looked at James again, seeing him with completely new eyes. This wasn't just a man who had stolen some food from a store. This was someone who had given everything for his country and had been failed by the very system he had served so faithfully. The theft he had committed wasn't the act of a criminal. It was the desperate action of a hero who had been pushed beyond his limits. The silence in the courtroom stretched on as Judge Richardson struggled to find the right words. She knew that whatever she said next would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. More importantly, she knew that James deserved far better treatment than he had received, both from society and from her own court. Judge Richardson placed the last document back in the folder and took a deep breath. Her hands were shaking as she removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench. The silence in the courtroom was so complete that everyone could hear the slight tremor in her breathing. For the first time in her 23 years as a judge, she found herself struggling to maintain her composure. She looked at James, who sat quietly in his wheelchair, waiting to hear his fate. His posture was straight and dignified, the bearing of a soldier even in the most difficult circumstances. Despite everything he had been through, despite the humiliation of being asked to stand when he could not, he maintained his dignity. This only made Judge Richardson feel worse about her earlier demand. "Mr. Washington," she began, her voice much softer than it had been at any point during the morning. The formal tone she usually used in her courtroom was gone, replaced by something more human, more personal. "I owe you an apology. A profound and sincere apology." The words seemed to echo in the quiet courtroom. James looked up at her with surprise, not understanding what was happening. He had prepared himself for jail time, for fines he could not afford, for further humiliation. An apology from the judge was the last thing he had expected. Judge Richardson stood up from her bench, something she rarely did during proceedings. The action drew everyone's attention and made the moment feel even more significant. "I was wrong to ask you to stand, completely and utterly wrong. You have already stood for all of us in ways that I am only now beginning to understand." Her voice wavered slightly as she continued. "In my years on this bench, I have seen thousands of cases, but I have never encountered someone who has given as much for this country as you have. You didn't just serve, you sacrificed everything. Your legs, your career, your peace of mind, your financial security. You gave it all so that others, including me, could live in freedom and safety." James felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. He had not expected this turn of events, had not prepared himself for kindness from the court. For months he had felt forgotten and abandoned by the very country he had served. To hear these words from a judge in a formal courtroom felt like a validation he had not received since leaving the military. Judge Richardson picked up the folder again and held it toward the courtroom. "This man is not a criminal. He is a hero who has been failed by the system he swore to protect. The documents in this folder tell the story of someone who repeatedly risked his life for others, who showed courage that most of us cannot even imagine." She began reading from one of the testimonials, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "According to his commanding officer, Sergeant Washington once crawled through enemy fire with badly injured legs to rescue 6 wounded soldiers. He refused medical treatment until every one of his men was safe. He was awarded the Bronze Star for Valor and the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat." The courtroom was completely silent as Judge Richardson continued. "This is the man we have before us today. Not a thief, but someone who has given everything for his country and received shamefully little in return. The theft he committed was not an act of greed or criminal intent. It was the desperate action of a hungry man who had been abandoned by the very system he had served so faithfully." Ms. Peterson wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to the judge speak. She had hoped that James's military record would make a difference, but she had never expected such a complete transformation in the judge's attitude. This speech was more than she had dared to hope for. In the gallery, James's mother was crying, openly now. She had watched her son struggle for years, had seen him become increasingly discouraged and depressed. To hear someone in authority finally recognize his worth and his sacrifice felt like a miracle. His sister squeezed their mother's hand, both of them hardly able to believe what they were hearing. Judge Richardson set the folder down and walked around to the front of her bench. This was highly unusual behavior for a judge, but nothing about this case was usual. She needed to be closer to James, to speak to him not as a judge to a defendant, but as one human being to another. Mr. Washington, I am going to do something I have never done in my entire career. I am going to ask for your forgiveness. What I asked of you earlier was not just inappropriate. It was cruel. You have stood for this country when it mattered, most in places where standing meant life or death for the soldiers under your command. I had no right to demand that you stand again, especially when your injuries make it impossible. James was openly crying now, not from shame or fear, but from relief and gratitude. For the first time since his injury, someone in authority was seeing him as more than his disability, more than his current circumstances. He was being recognized for who he really was and what he had done. Your Honor, James said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I never expected an apology. I came here today prepared to accept whatever punishment you decided was appropriate. To hear you say these things, to have my service recognized, means more than I can express. Judge Richardson nodded and continued her remarks. The charges against you are hereby dismissed immediately, but that is not enough. I am also directing the court administrator to contact Veteran Services on your behalf. We will ensure that you receive every benefit you have earned, every service you need, and every bit of support this system owes you. The courtroom erupted in quiet applause, with several people wiping tears from their eyes. Even the court reporter was visibly moved by what she was witnessing. This was the kind of moment that reminded everyone present why the justice system existed, not just to punish wrongdoing, but to protect and serve those who deserved society's support. But Judge Richardson was not finished. She returned to her bench and made an announcement that surprised everyone in the courtroom. I want everyone here to know that what we have witnessed today has changed me as a judge and as a person. This case has reminded me that justice is not just about following rules and procedures. True justice requires wisdom, compassion, and the courage to recognize when our system has failed someone who deserved better. She looked directly at James as she continued. I am implementing new procedures in this courtroom immediately. Never again will someone with a disability be required to stand if they are physically unable to do so. More importantly, I'm going to work with local veteran organizations to ensure that cases involving veterans are handled with the special consideration they deserve. James felt overwhelmed by the judge's words and actions. In the span of 30 minutes, his life had been transformed. He had entered the courtroom expecting condemnation and punishment. Instead, he was leaving with his dignity restored and his future looking brighter than it had in years. Judge Richardson stepped down from her bench one more time and approached James's wheelchair. In an unprecedented move, she knelt down beside him, bringing herself to his eye level. The symbolism of the action was not lost on anyone in the courtroom. The judge was literally lowering herself to honor someone she now recognized as her superior in courage and sacrifice. Sergeant Washington, she said quietly, using his military rank for the first time. Thank you for your service, thank you for your sacrifice, and thank you for reminding me what true honor looks like. I am privileged to have met you, and I will never forget this day. James reached out and shook her hand, a gesture that sealed not just the end of his legal troubles but the beginning of a new chapter in his life. Thank you, Your Honor. Your words today have given me something I thought I had lost forever, the feeling that my service mattered. As Judge Richardson returned to her bench, she made one final announcement. This court is adjourned. But instead of leaving immediately as she usually did, she remained standing as James was helped from the defendant's table. She wanted to honor his departure, just as she had failed to honor his presence earlier. James's family rushed to his side, embracing him with tears of joy and relief. His mother whispered in his ear how proud she was, not just of his military service, but of how he had conducted himself throughout this entire ordeal. His sister promised that things would be different now, that the support the judge had promised would make a real difference in his life. Ms. Peterson gathered her papers with a smile on her face. This case would become a story she would tell for the rest of her career, an example of how the justice system could work when it recognized the humanity in every person who appeared before it. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Judge Richardson remained at her bench, thinking about the lesson she had learned that day. James Washington had taught her that true respect was not shown through standing or sitting, but through recognizing the worth and dignity of every person, especially those who had sacrificed the most for others. The story of what happened in Judge Richardson's courtroom that day spread quickly through the legal community and beyond. It became an example of how justice could be both firm and compassionate, how the law could serve not just to punish, but to heal and restore. Most importantly, it showed that it is never too late to admit when we are wrong and to make things right.